Please, just calm down. Ow, what's wrong with him? How are we ever supposed to do this? Furina cleared her throat, entering the room, and watching as it fell silent with her presence. The scene in front of her was nothing short of chaotic. 3 servants surrounding the man she had brought in, and one of them with a large gash on his arm. His hair looked like an utter mess. Seaweed and other objects scattered around on the ground, as they had tried so kindly to untangle his hair and remove them. Meanwhile, the dragon she had brought looked like a cornered feral cat. His eyes narrowed and the thin slits threatening, as he hissed when one of them tried taking a step toward him. Lady Furina, we've been trying our best. We did our best to follow your orders, but he's being unreasonably difficult and hostile. One of the servants exclaimed, hoping that she won't have to face her wrath. Furina only giggled, shaking her head. That's to be expected. I suppose he's not really used to this amount of physical contact. You are dismissed. I'll deal with the matter personally, she ordered. She was Focalor. She was dauntless, fearless, and unchallenged. But, Lady Furina, an alarmed voice interjected, but Furina quickly shut down the objection. Leave. I promise I'll be perfectly fine. I am your Archon, after all. Such matters are of no difficulty for me. Don't worry yourselves. And that was how Furina and the dragon ended up in a closed room alone. Truth to be said, she was worried, maybe even slightly intimidated. She could not let him find out about her lack of power at all, and as he seemed particularly distressed, she did not want to add to it. She needed to be gentle and tactful about this. You did not utter a single word since you agreed to come with me. Are you disappointed? Is something not up to your standards? I wish to communicate with you clearly. She spoke softly and slowly, sitting down on the carpet as she smiled gently at him. She hoped he would see that she had not meant to bother him by doing this. But he definitely needed a lot of work on his appearance if he were to blend in with the general public. The way his slit eyes narrowed as he looked into her own for a moment made her nervous. But then he looked away with a pout, seemingly struggling to say something, as if he were embarrassed. I do not like strangers touching my hair, he whispered, and his voice was raspy from disuse. Furina understood. She was demanding way too much all at once. He lived in the oceans, in the seas of Teyvat. He was not used to being confined in such a manner. To make him come here was one thing, but she could not expect him to be suddenly so comfortable with all those strangers, especially since he was not used to interacting with humans, regardless of his own human appearance. May I do it then? I'll be gentle. It won't hurt, she asked. She would have to accept that if he refused, but she'd hoped that he would be more willing to let her try. Neuvillette eyed her for a couple of moments, then nodded as he closed his eyes. A show of trust, much like a cat, she thought. Her heart melted as she chuckled softly to herself and stood behind him as he sat down on the ground. The only way to make things easy for her, as he was way taller. She took off her gloves, setting them aside, and began to gently pick out the weeds from his hair, one by one, and put them away. He was stiff at first, his shoulders straight as a board. It was almost worrying. She had hoped he wouldn't be wary of her, but she knew it was something that could only be achieved through the passage of time. As she got caught up in the work, delicately entangling his white long hair, she began to hum. It was a melody she'd picked up from a recent opera she watched, one that made her cry for hours on end from the tragedy of it all. It was beautifully heart-wrenching, two hearts intertwined, close enough and yet too far away to get their happy ending. She did not notice the way Neuvillette relaxed as she continued to hum quietly, the way he closed his eyes as he let himself be lulled into the peaceful atmosphere she created by her dulcet voice and her deft movements. The way he seemed so utterly different from how he was just mere minutes ago. They stayed like this for an hour at least, Furina brushing out the tangles from his hair gently and slowly, as not to cause him pain, and Neuvillette listening to the soft humming that made his breaths come slow and easy, made his muscles intense, and his shoulders relax in a way he did not think he'd be able to around anyone. He could not help the small frown on his face when she stopped her humming, or when she tied that bow around his hair, because it meant she was done. She got up and walked around him to get a full look, and grinned, pleased with her work. "Wonderful! You look great now. See? There was nothing to worry about." Her grin was brighter than 1,000 suns and warmer than anything he had seen, that the frown on his face melted away, replaced by heat that made his cheeks slightly redder than they should be. "You're right," he said, quiet, and Furina's face had softened as she looked at him before she walked toward the door. But she paused, turning around to face him once more and smiling again. Neuvillette did not know much about humans yet, or about Furina their Archon, but he could tell this smile was different from the other smiles. It was smaller, kind, and more fragile in a way he did not understand. It shone differently than her other smile. Instead of a sun, it felt like a limit-well in the deep dark oceans. "Thank you for trusting me, Neuvillette," she said softly, relief and gratitude showing in her words. And before he could analyze her face or her expression even more, she had already left the room, closing the door behind her. It was the first day of many then. Many more days where she would sit behind him and brush his hair, untangling it, as she hummed and he let his mind fall apart at her soft voice that touched his heart like nothing else could. It was the first day of many more firsts he would also come to learn, each passing day only rounding out the edges around his jagged heart and melting the ice that surrounded it until it was back to what it was always meant to be. It was also the day that he would look back on many, many years later and realize that she not only usurped his power, but also his heart.